Welcome to Things You Don't Know. In this episode, we're looking at a really surprising collaboration of divergent groups. These groups are the Black Panthers, the John Birch Society, and the Disabled in Action Group. Pretty disparate people. The common goal which brought these groups together was equality and fair treatment of all people. First, we need to set the stage by giving a brief history of each of these organizations. Then we will examine a surprising event where these disparate groups collaborated. Strange. This is a strange, perhaps even bizarre incident. Both the Panthers and the Birchers, they're patriots, albeit with very different agendas and ideologies.
That's absolutely true. Their agendas are different. Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, commonly known simply as the Black Panther Party, was founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huie Newton and Bobby Seale. Here is a detailed overview of the origins of the Black Panther Party. During the 1960s, the civil rights movement was at its peak, with various organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, advocating for civil rights through nonviolent means. Despite these efforts, many African Americans in urban areas, especially in the north and western part of the country, where segregation was by custom, not law, continued to face severe police violence, poverty, and social injustice. People often express this stupid idea that once an African American got to the north, everything would be fine for them.
Wow. That is a stupid, or at least totally false idea. Of course, prejudice and discrimination existed in the South and East. All of that was wrong and unacceptable for any country that claimed freedom for everyone.
Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965 highlighted the frustration and anger in Black communities across the country over police brutality, economic disparity, and systematic racism. The two primary Panther organizers, Huie Newton and Bobby Seale, as we said before, were college students at Merritt College in Oakland, California, and were heavily influenced by a number of revolutionary thinkers, such as Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, Mao Zedong, and Che Guevara. Robert Williams, who formed Radio Free Dixie in Cuba and advocated armed uprisings throughout the South against both the Klan and the White Citizens Council, served as an early mentor to Huie Newton. Many former California and Oregon members of the Nation of Islam joined the Panthers as a result of their frustration with Elijah Muhammad's focus on building wealth at the expense of political autonomy for what the Panthers called the oppressed masses. A number of recruits, cadres of the Maoist Communist Labor Party, joined forces with the Panthers when Bobby Seale took China's side in its disagreement with the Soviet Union over which nation was truer, the Marxist orthodoxy.
Newton and Seale initially founded the Black Panthers as a means of self-defense against police brutality in Black communities. The term for self-defense emphasized the belief that citizens, particularly Black citizens, had the right to use whatever means necessary, including the use of deadly force when faced with others using deadly force, including what they considered illegal use of force by the police. Their focus on armed self-protection, in contrast to the nonviolent tactics used by other civil rights groups, was remarkable. Newton and Seal formulated the party's foundational principles in the 10-point program, which outlined the party's demands for freedom, employment, decent housing, education, and an end to police brutality, among other issues. Not outrageous demands. The Black Panther Party combined elements of Marxist Leninist with Black nationalism. It advocated for community control of resources. The Panthers were inspired by Malcolm X's teachings on Black empowerment and self-defense. They sought to build on his legacy of rejecting nonviolent resistance when faced with violent oppression. While initially focusing on monitoring police activity and preventing police brutality, the BPP, Black Panthers Party, quickly expanded its scope to address broader issues of social justice and community needs. They established community-based groups, such as free breakfast programs for children, health clinics, education, and transportation services for the elderly. These, quote, survival programs aimed to meet immediate needs in underserved Black communities and build grassroots support. The Panthers' open carry of firearms and bold stance against police brutality put them in direct conflict with local and federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, launched Quantrill counterintelligence program to infiltrate, undermine, and dismantle the Black Panther Party, branding it as a significant threat to national security. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Seems like that's happened a few times. Despite facing intense repression, internal challenges such as Newton being jailed, perhaps on shaky grounds, and some decline in membership in the late 1970s, the Black Panther Party's impact is still felt today in civil rights, racial justice, and community activism discussions. They were dissolved in the 1980s. Now, another group called New Black Panthers did form in the 2005 time, but they were not based on the same principles and the same guidance that the Black Panthers were founded on. So they cannot be accurately described as the Black Panther Party anymore. The Black Panther Party's origins reflect a very complex combination of grassroots activism, ideological development, and direct response to systemic injustices faced by Black Americans. The Black Panther Party joined the efforts of the disability rights activists in a sit-in protest referred to as the 504 sit-in. We'll take a look at how these two groups came together in 1977 to make history in San Francisco. So, in 1977, a group of brave disability rights activists occupied a federal building in San Francisco to demand enforcement of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, this provision was one of the first disability civil rights laws in the United States, prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities in any program or activity receiving federal assistance. Yet, for 4 years, the government had dragged its feet on implementing these regulations. Frustrated and determined, around 150 protesters, led by Mary Jane Owen, Katie Cohen, and Judy Human, took matters into their own hands. Now, Dr. Deneen, you've been a quieter proponent of civil rights, especially in the arena of disability rights. And I understand you also met Judy Heumann.
I did. She was a pioneer leader for decades and a great help to my friend and mentor, Leslie Finelli, who has been on our podcasts about Spartan women, bizarre laws, and the life and achievements of Eleanor Roosevelt. But here's where our story takes a very surprising turn. The protest, known as the 504 sit-in, became, now pay attention to this, friends, this is important, the longest nonviolent occupation of a federal building in U.S. history, lasting for 26 days. The assistance of the Black Panthers and the Birchers made that extended length of occupation possible, which goes to the heart of this episode. You heard that right, the Black Panther Party. The Panthers are often remembered for their militant stand against police brutality and their fight for Black liberation. But their community work, such as the Free Breakfast for Children program, health clinics, and educational initiatives, often gets overshadowed. And it is precisely this commitment to community support that led them to aid the 504 sit-in. Let us rewind a bit to understand how this alliance came to be. The 1970s were a time of significant political and social upheaval. Various movements were gaining momentum across the United States. Second wave feminists, LGBTQ plus rights activists, Native American activists, and of course, disability rights activists. At the same time, Black Panthers, having faced severe repression from COINTELPRO and the FBI, was shifting its focus more towards community service and coalition building. When the 504 activists began their sit-in at the Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW building in San Francisco, they faced a number of immediate challenges. Chief among them was literal survival. These are all people with severe physical disabilities. They require specific accommodation, medical supplies, accessibility, assistance with personal care, and food that met their dietary needs. This is the 1970s when accessibility was not a priority in most public places. Enter the Black Panther Party. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Black Panther Party was its ability to see the interconnectedness of struggles. They understood fighting for justice meant fighting for all marginalized people. This perspective led them to extend their hand in solidarity to groups outside of the African American community. Brad Lomax, a Black Panther member with multiple sclerosis, played a crucial role in bridging the gap between the Panthers and the disability rights activists. As a disabled person, Lomax had a foot in both worlds. He realized the need for solidarity across the movements and facilitated the Panthers' involvement. They saw the sit-in as a just cause and immediately stepped up. Every day, throughout the 26 days of the sit-in, they delivered hot meals to the protesters, many of whom were physically unable to leave the building to get food, as well as assisting in delivering their medications and helping with personal care. As a wheelchair user, my friends, I can tell you sometimes navigating that daily experience is very difficult. The Panthers' Free Breakfast program, which had nourished countless Black children across the country, now extended its reach to the disabled activists at HEW. It wasn't just about food, though. It was about moral support, about showing up for another marginalized group fighting for their rights.
As Mary Jane Owen said, we had no idea how long we'd be in there. But when the Black Panthers came in with trays of hot food daily, it lifted our spirits. They saw us, and they stood with us. Very powerful quote. The Black Panthers' support went beyond just meals. They used their networks to bring attention to the sit-in, connecting it with broader struggles for human rights. They understood that all oppression is interconnected, and by supporting the 504 activists, they were continuing their own fight against systemic injustice. Their solidarity helped sustain the sit-in and strengthened the resolve of the activists inside the building. This cross-movement collaboration highlighted the power of unity in resistance, and after 26 days of occupying the Huie building, the activists achieved their goal. Joseph Califano, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Huie, finally signed the regulations to implement Section 504, marking a huge victory for the disability rights movement. But this victory wasn't just about a piece of legislation. It was about the solidarity that made it possible. The alliance between the Black Panthers and the 504 protesters stands as a powerful example of how different movements can come together, support one another, and create transformative change. And there you have it, a story of revolutionary solidarity that helped change the course of history. The Black Panther Party's involvement in the 504 sit-ins reminds us that true liberation requires us to fight for each other, to stand up not just for our own communities, but for anyone facing injustice. Another unexpected group joined the cause. In one of those ironies that history seems to love, an ultra-right-wing organization would ally themselves with this cause for their own reasons. It was almost unthinkable that the ultra-conservative John Birch Society would join the Panthers in supporting the 504 protesters, but join they did. How did this group emerge from the fringes of American politics to become a significant player in the fight against communism? Well, understand how unlikely this joint effort was. And we need to take a look at the formation, ideology, and overall history of the John Birch Society. A thought kind of occurs to me concerning these fringe groups. First, it seems to me that they're founded on fear rather than progress. The other thought about this is that it seems to me that if you truly have faith and confidence in our republic and believe that we have the best form of government, it would make it highly probable that the republic, in our opinion, would stand up to that criticism. It harkens thoughts about how the domino theory spread like wildfire.
As a historian, Dr. Weaver, may I say that you're quite correct in saying that extremist groups of any ideological bent are founded on fear. The idea that people of these groups have, they believe their lives would be perfect if only those pesky business people, communists, trilateral commission members, or whatever the boogeyman of the week is, would simply disappear. During the Cold War early period, the legitimate concerns about Soviet power exploded into a miasma of terror beyond all limits. This idea of helplessness and a desire for control is encapsulated by the John Birch Society and its founder, Robert Welch.
Okay, let's trace the history of this group so we can better understand how remarkable the coming together of these three groups truly was.
Robert Welch was a child prodigy. He graduated high school at 11 years old and a wealthy businessman from North Carolina. He made his fortune in the candy industry as a co-founder of his older brothers, the James O. Welch Company. They're best known for, hang on to your hats, folks, creating sugar babies and products like Junior Mints. But Welch was not just a candy magnate. He was also deeply concerned about what he saw as The Creeping Influence of Communism in the United States, an avid reader with a penchant for conspiracy theories. Welch was convinced that communism wasn't just a distant threat, but was an internal one. In his words, infiltrating the highest levels of American society. In December 1958, Welch convened a meeting of 11 of his most like-minded friends and businessmen and retired military officers in Indianapolis, Indiana. For 2 straight days, Welch delivered an exhaustive speech outlining his belief that a conspiracy was afoot, a conspiracy to overthrow the American government and replace it with a communist dictatorship. He believed this plot was already underway and that it involved prominent figures in politics, business, and academia. It was at this meeting that the John Birch Society was born. But who was John Birch? To understand the name, we need to step back to the end of World War II. John Birch was an American military intelligence officer and Baptist deacon who served in China during the war. In 1945, shortly after the war ended, Birch was killed by Chinese communist forces in an encounter that to this day remains somewhat shrouded in mystery. For Welch and his followers, Birch was the first casualty of the Cold War and a martyr in the fight against communism. By naming the society after Birch, Welch intended to create a symbol of patriotic sacrifice and unwavering diligence against communist subversion.
The John Birch Society was founded with a clear mission to combat the spread of communism in the United States and around the world. But this wasn't just about communists abroad. The JBS saw enemies everywhere, within the government, within the civil rights movement, and within any organization that advocated for social change or international cooperation. The Society's message spread, particularly among some sectors of middle-class Americans who were already anxious about the rapid social changes taking place in the post-war era. Welch's writings, especially his self-published The Blue Book of the John Birch Society and The Politician, were circulated within the extreme right. In The Politician, Welch infamously accused President Dwight D. Eisenhower of, get this, being a conscious, dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. Really? A conservative president? Yeah, okay. Anyhow, I claim that even some of Welch's closest associates found too extreme. Despite its fringe rhetoric, the John Birch Society rapidly grew in influence during the 1960s, at least in some segments. With its network of chapters across the country, the JBS became known for its grassroots organization efforts, pamphleteering, and letter writing campaigns. While the Society preached a strict anti-communist line, it also opposed many aspects of the civil rights movement, viewing it as a part of a broader communist plot to destabilize America. The JBS's messaging aligned with the broader conservative backlash against the federal government and social reforms, providing a framework for opposing everything from desegregation to the United Nations. Across the nation, the John Birch Society members took to the streets, organized rallies, and distributed literature. Their message was clear: America is under attack, not just from without, but from within. However, not everyone was on board with the John Birch Society's vision, in my opinion, Good Lord. As the 1960s progressed, even some conservative leaders distanced themselves from the John Birch Society. William F. Buckley Jr., the influential editor of the National Review magazine, took a stand against Welch and the JBS. He argued that their conspiracy theories and extreme rhetoric undermined the conservative movement's credibility. Buckley's efforts to marginalize the John Birch Society partially succeeded, but pushing the group further to the fringes.
Yet, the John Birch Society's impact on American politics and conservatism cannot be underestimated. Their grassroots tactics, emphasis on small government, and suspicion of internationalism have echoes in today's political landscape, from the Tea Party movement to modern-day discussions about the perils of the deep state. So what is the legacy of the John Birch Society? It is a complicated one. On one hand, fear-mongering, conspiracy-driven worldviews have contributed to the polarization and distrust of government institutions we see today. On the other hand, the JBS demonstrated the power of grassroots activism in shaping national discourse, particularly on the American right. I was amazed to discover the involvement of Julia Brown, George Schuler, and Manning Johnson with the Birch Society. These three patriotic African Americans became involved with a group that was at its core a bastion of conservative anti-communist and often reactionary white politics. The complex paths that led them to the Birch Society are convoluted and surprising. To understand how this happened, we need to take a closer look at the lives and ideologies of Julia Brown, George Schuler, and Manning Johnson. Julia Brown is perhaps one of the most curious cases in this story. A former member of the Communist Party USA, Brown had a religious awakening and later became a staunch anti-communist and an informant for the FBI. She had joined the Communist Party in the 1940s, believing in its promises of racial equality and justice. However, her experience within the party disillusioned her. Brown claimed she saw communists manipulating civil rights organizations like the NAACP to sow division and chaos in American society. Her disillusionment with the party led her to renounce communism and dedicate herself to exposing what she saw as its dangers. Brown's fervent anti-communist stance made her the perfect match for the John Birch Society, which was always on the lookout for credible voices to speak against what they viewed as a communist threat in America. The society fully embraced her, sent her on paid speaking tours across the country, where she would talk about her experiences in the Communist Party and warn of its dangers. To the John Birch Society, Brown offered a dual benefit. She was a Black woman who could counter accusations that the organization was racist, and her background as a former communist insider gave her warnings a sense of urgency and authenticity. She plays a big role in this protest movement here because she was passionate about liberating people with exceptionalities from what she called the dangerously addictive narcotic of charity and pity. Brown played a large role in the Birch Society's support for the 504 protests, opening the pages of American Opinion, the then official JBS magazine, to George Mason professor Walter Williams, author of The State Against Blacks and a strong supporter of what he called economic self-determination for all people. Perhaps an even more shocking case is George Schuler, one of the most complex figures in African American intellectual history. Schuler began his career as a journalist and social critic, writing for the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading Black newspapers in America, as well as for the American Mercury under the patronage of H.L. Mencken. In the 20s and 30s, he was known for his biting satire and critiques of racism and what he saw as the empty promises of communism. While Schuller initially flirted with socialism, he quickly turned away from it. Over time, his views evolved into a staunch libertarian conservatism. He believed in free enterprise, self-reliance, and in minimalist government. Schuller's skepticism of both government intervention in the economy and organized civil rights organizations, which he often accused of being influenced by communism, made him suspicious of organized protests. This was stated in Georgia University's president, Dr. Gail Tate's Dimensions of Black Conservatives.
Schuller's career had started on the left, but over time he shifted to the right, becoming a vocal critic of the civil rights movement and a supporter of conservative causes. Though not officially a member of the John Birch Society, he had sympathized with its anti-communist positions and became somewhat of an intellectual ally. His association with the John Birch Society, whatever it was, began in 1961, when Robert Welch wrote an article in support of Katanga seceding from the Congo. Schuller was the ultimate outsider, married to a white Texas oil heiress, Josephine Lewis. He married her in 1929 when interracial marriage was against the law in 28 states. By the mid-1970s, Schuller was involved in various conservative advocacy efforts, including an obscure group known as the Truth About Civil Turmoil Committee. TACTC was formed as a sort of conservative watchdog, claiming to investigate and expose what it called subversive elements behind civil unrest in the United States. The committee was loosely affiliated with the John Birch Society, and it worked to provide an alternative narrative to the mainstream media's portrayal of social movements in the country. Sounds sort of familiar to me, about maybe some news organizations or purported news organizations that are actually licensed as entertainment channels on the TV. George Schuller, always a pragmatist, saw an opportunity in the 504 sit-in that he believed could be leveraged in both criticize big government overreach and to demonstrate the failures of liberal policies. Schuller had always maintained that communists or radical elements could exploit social issues like civil rights and welfare to destabilize America. At the same time, he was a fierce critic of government bureaucracy. Now, Schuller approached the leadership of the Truth About Civil Turmoil Committee with a bold idea. He suggested that the John Birch Society and other conservative groups could publicly support the 504 activists, specifically because the government's refusal to enforce the Rehabilitation Act, in their view, showed the failure and corruption of big government. In his view, this would present the JBS not as an organization opposed to civil rights per se, but as one that stood against the government's ineptitude and overreach. He hailed the Rehab Act as a law created by people with exceptionalities themselves to replace welfare with wages. Schuller also had a personal connection with another prominent exceptionality activist, Justin Dart Jr., one of the prime movers behind the Americans with Disabilities Act. Dart's grandfather, drugstore kingpin Charles Walgreen, had paid for Schuller's research in Liberia in the 1930s. Schuller's alignment with the John Birch Society was rooted in his belief that communism posed a threat not only to American democracy, but to the potential progress of African Americans. He was wary of the civil rights movement's turn towards more direct government involvement in securing civil rights, fearing it could lead to a kind of bureaucratic despotism. His libertarian ethos resonated with the Birch Society's anti-collectivist stance. However, his association with the society was less formal than Brown's. As Schuler said, if there's a better example of the government's broken promises, I'd like to see it. What these people want is what every American should demand: dignity, accountability, and a stop to government bungling. Schuler's proposal was unorthodox, to say the least. After all, the JBS and the Black Panthers had very little in common beyond their disdain for perceived government corruption. Yet, some within the John Birch Society saw an opportunity to reshape public perception, or at least to disrupt the narrative that conservatives were always the bad guys in these social struggles. The Truth About Civil Turmoil Committee was used as a trial balloon to explore this potential collaboration. The TAC-TC members reached out to disability rights activists and, through some back channels, even contacted the Black Panthers to suggest a joint effort to spotlight the government's failure to uphold its own laws. The idea was simple: focus on the common enemy, the federal government's lack of action and accountability. To everyone's surprise, the Black Panthers didn't immediately reject the overture. While wary of any alliance with the John Birch Society and its affiliated groups, the Panthers were pragmatic revolutionaries. They understood that alliances, even temporary and uncomfortable ones, could sometimes serve a greater purpose. It helped that George Schuler was a familiar name. His columns had appeared in black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier for decades. And while his later conservative trend alienated many, some still respected his sharp wit and analytical mind. However, this alliance remained largely behind the scenes. There was no formal announcement or public embrace. Instead, what followed was a sort of tacit, uneasy cooperation. The John Birch Society, through TAC-TC and other intermediaries, provided some logistical support to the protesters at the 504 sit-in, not on the front lines like the Panthers, but through legal aid, media outreach, and even some funding for the activists. This allowed the JBS to frame their involvement as standing up for the rights of all Americans against government tyranny, even while maintaining their anti-communist and anti-socialist rhetoric. An ABC newscaster on the scene of the 504 sit-in said, "The disability rights activists at the Huie building have received support from a variety of unexpected allies, with some conservative groups speaking out against government inaction, citing it as another example of federal overreach and paternalism." Mm-hmm. While this unusual cooperation did not turn into a long-term partnership, it certainly added a unique dimension to the struggle over Section 504. Both the John Birch Society and the Black Panthers managed to gain something from this strange alliance. The JBS got to reframe part of its image, if only temporarily, as defenders of individual rights rather than just opponents of civil rights and social change. The Panthers, on the other hand, got additional logistic support and a bizarre but useful narrative to wield against the federal government. For the Truth About Civil Turmoil Committee, this experiment in alliance building was a demonstration of how political lines can blur under certain circumstances. George Schuler, ever the contrarian, saw it as a validation of his belief that the true fault lines in American politics were not necessarily about race, but about power, control, and government overreach.
So, what does this episode tell us about the possibilities and limitations of political alliances? It's a reminder that sometimes, in the old cliche, politics does make for strange bedfellows. Ideological purists might scoff, but history is full of unexpected collaborations that, however briefly, serve a common cause. May I just say, my friends, that I knew the basics of this story, but I was surprised beyond all belief when I dug into it some more. Judy Heumann and her supporters were the intellectual godparents of a generation of activists, people I'll be talking about in another podcast, like Dr. Brooke Ellison, Dr. Andrew Kramer, and many others, who was my personal privilege to know. And I really believe, my friends, that this laid the foundation of the world we're living in today. Without accessibility and access to equal education, I wouldn't have the wonderful experience of being a Kane University history and lately English professor, or to have traveled the world to have done my research. I owe a great debt to these people, and this is my small way of acknowledging it.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for joining us today. And we have some good things coming up, and we are going to say goodbye for now.
So long, everyone.